Hey everybody, this is Russ from Retro Game Core. Today we're going to check out the GKD Bubble. And I would say this handheld is pretty interesting. It is a mix of both old and new. And when I'm talking about old, I mean the fact that it's using an older chipset, the RK3566, but then also it is shaped almost identically to an old Game Gear. And I don't know about you, but back in the day, I really wanted a Game Gear. This thing was so cool. It was black and had like a color LCD, and it was also backlit. And so I always wanted to try one of these out. And so right off the bat, the GKD Bubble transports me back to 1990 when I really wanted to get my hands on one of these. And like I mentioned, this device is a mix of old and new. The new part is that it's a retro handheld, which means it's going to be able to emulate a lot of more modern systems. And so in this video, I want to break it all down and see whether or not that nostalgia trip is going to be worth it for the hardware that we're getting for around 75 bucks. And so without any further delay, let's go ahead and dive in. Okay, let's start by going over the specs. The processor here is the Rockchip RK3566. We've seen this in probably about 10 different handhelds over the past couple years, and it's about a mid-tier. It's going to be able to play up to PS1 with no problem, and you will be able to play at least half of the Nintendo 64, Dreamcast, and PSP libraries. Now, I don't have a ton of information about this handheld, but generally this chipset comes with either 1 or 2 gigs of RAM. And generally those with 2 gigs of RAM usually boot into Android as well. This one only boots into Linux, so I'm going to guess here that it's only 1. Now the screen here is very standard, 3.5 inches, 640 by 480 resolution with an aspect ratio of 4:3. And we've got a good sized battery here, 4000 milliamp hours. That's going to give us between like 4 and 6 hours of gameplay. Now out of the box it is going to come with a Linux-based operating system, but I have seen that somebody's working on Android for it as well, and so we might see that in the future someday. Other than that, we've got a pretty standard feature set for RK3566 devices. This does have Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, and HDMI out. Now my review unit was sent over from a third-party retailer named KeepRetro.com. I've used them in several videos before. Now they are reselling this for $76 right now online. That's going to come with free shipping. But I've also seen the device listed on AliExpress for around the same price, between $75 and $80. If you wanted to pick it up there, you could as well. I'll leave links to the KeepRetro store down below, and like with all my other reviews, they're not going to see this ahead of time, no money was exchanged in any way, and all opinions are my own. Now let's jump into the unboxing. We've got 2 color options, both red and black, and as you've probably already figured out, the color they sent me is red. So let's take a look inside, and we've got the handheld itself, and then underneath we've got an inspection sticker as well as a quick startup guide. And this includes a button diagram and then a couple of just common and FAQ issues. Now looking at the device itself, yeah, I really do like this red color. You know, I kind of wanted the black one to start, but I don't know, I'm kind of liking this red one even though it is not a very traditional color. So let's start with first impressions, and of course, you know, number one is that it reminds me of a Game Gear, but I think the other thing that really stood out about this is the texture of the plastic. Now this is really hard to capture on camera, but essentially it has a very light and matte feel. In fact, I bet people will say that this is a very cheap feeling, like it almost feels like a toy, like a Fisher-Price toy. I kind of don't mind that. Again, this is a plastic retro handheld device that's under $100, and so I kind of like the fact that it reminds me of playing around with a toy. It's almost like treating this like a Tiger Electronics handheld, you know, those that we used to get for like 20 bucks, but this thing can play like 10,000 games instead. So right off the bat, I think that this plastic texture is going to be a little bit polarizing, and I'm on the side where I think that this is actually pretty cool. But if you're looking for something very sleek and modern feeling, this is not it. This feels like it's from the 1990s. Now, before we jump into things like buttons and controls, I want to do some size comparisons to give you an idea of just how big or small this handheld is. And I think we should start with the original Game Gear. Now, like I mentioned in the intro, I always wanted one of these, and I actually have one right now. And this was actually sent over from one of my viewers, Michael Benny. This is the Game Gear that he had as a child growing up, and so it's super awesome that he sent it over so I could check it out. I got a bunch of plans for this, including trying to change out the screen, but we will save that for a different day. For now, I wanted to give a size comparison to show you that yes, the original Game Gear was quite a bit bigger. And the original screen was 3.2 inches with a resolution of 160 by 144. And so even though the GKD Bubble is a lot smaller than the Game Gear, the screen is larger and it has a much higher resolution. Next, let's compare it against other devices using the same chip, the RK3566. To start, we have the Anbernic RG353PS. This one's modeled after a Super Nintendo controller, and this one has the exact same screen dimensions as well, and you can see they're about the same size. Sticking with devices that have the same chipset but are also modeled after other controllers, this one is the Anbernic RG Arc. This one has a larger screen. It's 4 inches, but has the same 640 by 480p resolution. And you can see here the RG Arc is a little bit larger than the GKD Bubble. Another device with the same chip is going to be the Powkiddy RGB30. This one has a 4-inch square aspect ratio screen with a resolution of 720 by 720. So this one does have a higher resolution and is a little bit smaller as well. But one thing worth noting is that all of those other devices with the same chipset are usually more expensive than the GKD Bubble. Generally, you'll find them around the $80 price point, but often you will find them upwards of like $100. And so the GKD Bubble, even coming out at its initial launch, is cheaper. Let's do a couple more comparisons. We'll start with the Retroid Pocket Mini. This one has a slightly larger screen. It's 3.7 inches, but you can see that overall the handheld is smaller. Next, we have a pretty similar device. This one is the Z Pocket Game A1 Unicorn. And even though they have different brand names, they're made by the same manufacturer. And one thing that's pretty similar between the two are the D-pads. They're almost the same, but the GKD Bubble is slightly larger. This one is more powerful and expensive and also is Android-based and has that same square aspect ratio screen that we saw in the Powkiddy RGB30. And then finally, because I'm sure you're wondering, here's a comparison with the Steam Deck OLED. And even though this is slightly larger when it comes to just the overall size, it's still pretty lightweight, 226 grams. For example, that is going to be lighter than the Anbernic RG Arc as well as the ZPG A1 Unicorn. Now, in terms of just overall comfort and feel, I think it is actually a pretty comfortable device. It is certainly round in all the right places, and it also has these nice little ergonomic bumps. Now, these are very slight bumps, so it's not going to make a huge difference in terms of your ergonomics, but I like the fact that they're there. I found that when holding the device, I use them as an anchor with my index fingers, and so I'll often hold them against the edge of the ergonomic bump. From there, my middle and ring fingers just go across the rest of the device, and then on the bottom, I usually will rest my pinky fingers just to kind of hold it into place. From there, if I need to, I can just move up my index fingers to grab those shoulder and trigger buttons, and it's been a pretty easy experience for me. And so I would say in terms of just overall comfort and feel, this is actually pretty great. I'm able to reach all the buttons no problem, and so I don't really have any ergonomic issues at all. Now let's move on to buttons. We'll start with the D-pad. Now they call this like a disc or a shield-based D-pad. And it does remind me of an older Sega style, but it's a little bit flatter, and so the cardinal points here don't stick out as much as you might expect. But in terms of just overall function, it does remind me a lot of a Sega D-pad. I can just kind of softly click in any direction. Okay, let's do a little D-pad testing. We'll start with the Contra test. And when I'm doing this test, I like to press down on the D-pad and then rock it left and right to see whether or not the character moves. And like with most other shield-based D-pads like this, it does not pass the Contra test, at least compared to a traditional crosswave D-pad. What this means is that as soon as I start moving it left and right, it'll start to go diagonally, and that's exactly how these D-pads are intended to be used. And so I wouldn't call this a failing of the D-pad, but just rather the actual design of it. What this means is that yes, you will probably hit a diagonal more often than not when using this D-pad, but it'll really depend on the game that you're trying to play. When it comes to something like Contra, when you don't want to do that from time to time, this might be a bad thing. Now when it comes to a fighting game like Street Fighter Third Strike, it's a different story. Here you do want to hit diagonals, and often it'll be pretty easy. Now in full disclosure, I'm not really used to playing these types of games with this type of D-pad, but I found at least with my own playstyle, I can do these single moves very easily, those that are just a single motion. So for example, a fireball or a hurricane kick, I can pull those off no problem. However, with something like a Dragon Punch, I do have a hard time. I found that more often than not, I'll just do a fireball instead, so I'm not really getting that full motion. And like I mentioned, I'm not super good with using a D-pad like this, so I'd probably need more time to mess around with it. But at least as it stands right now, this doesn't feel to be as precise as I would like, even compared to other disc-based D-pads. And so when it comes down to it, it's an okay D-pad. I think with particular games, things like Contra or Street Fighter, it may not be the best fit, but for most other games, it'll probably be okay. And so I think it is similar to other Sega D-pads in the fact that it is quite rounded and pivots very easily, but I would say this one's a little bit looser. If you look at the Game Gear D-pad, it's also very similar in shape, but it's quite a bit mushier, so it doesn't move down as much and doesn't pivot as easily. Now this can be a good or a bad thing. Personally, I think it's a little bit mushy for my tastes. And so personally, I would rather have something that's a little bit more responsive and less mushy. It does mean that I'll probably have to acclimate to the sensitivity of this, but overall, I still think it's going to be workable. Of note, the plastic shell around the D-pad is actually pretty neat in the fact that it's kind of cut away here to make room for your thumb, and they did the same thing here with the GKD Bubble. So I do like those little design touches as well. I think it's pretty cool. Next up we have the analog sticks, and nothing fancy here, these are just your standard Nintendo Switch style Joy-Con sticks. They don't have a huge range of motion, but they still work pretty well. And depending on the type of games that you're playing, you'll probably not use these analog sticks too much compared to the D-pad. And so I do appreciate the fact that this is a D-pad centric device and they put it up top. Okay, next let's talk about these face buttons. So these are pretty unique. They have two different sizes to them. The ones on the left you can see are smaller and convex, but then the ones on the right are larger and then they have a concave shape to them as well. And I found that when playing games, this is really handy because it allows me to differentiate between the two very easily. And again, looking at the Game Gear, it's a pretty similar setup. You can see that we have concave buttons on this one as well. And so personally, I like that they did something different here, and they have two different sizes and two different shapes. It just is a kind of unique experience. The buttons themselves are rubber membrane. They have a nice feel to them. They're very tactile. And so they do spring up very easily, and I think they have a good amount of travel to them as well. So I like these buttons. And they also carved out a section like with the D-pad for these face buttons. And so it's super comfortable to have an inset like this. Now this button up here you might think is the start button, but it's not. It's down here. And this one here is the select button. And I gotta say the placement of this menu button has thrown me off quite a few times because like you can see here on the Game Gear, this is where the start button is. I mean, it even has the same shape to it. And so often I will press this button thinking it's the start button and it'll bring up the menu instead. And so that has definitely been annoying and something that might bother you as well. Now let's take a look at the top. We have our shoulder and trigger buttons. We'll come back to those. Then we have a power button, then a micro HDMI. Then we have a 3.5mm headphone jack, and then one of our two SD card slots. This one is for the OS. And then finally we have what they call a home button. This will change what it does depending on the game that you're playing. Now the shoulder and trigger buttons are inline, as you can see, and the trigger buttons are a little bit taller than the shoulders. The buttons themselves are relatively thin considering the size of the case, but they are easy to find with your finger, and so I've had no problems actually using them. The buttons themselves have a rubber membrane connection. They actually feel pretty darn good when you push them down. They have a lot more travel and are a little bit more satisfying than your typical shoulder and trigger buttons like this. In fact, if we look at the ZPG A1 Unicorn, you can see that it has very similar buttons, but these are clicky micro switches. And so these ones have a lot less travel to them, but I would say the Bubble is more satisfying to use. Of note, the design is very similar to them, but these buttons are more towards the back of the device, and I found that actually to be a little bit easier to use. Now on the left and right, we don't have any sort of buttons or anything, so let's look at the bottom. So here we have two stereo speakers, then we have our other micro SD card slot. This is going to be for your games. And then finally, we've got our USB port for charging and peripherals, then our volume up and down buttons. Of note, my device came with two SD cards, so it'll come with an operating system card here, 64 gigabytes. This will come standard. And then if you'd like, you can also purchase a second card, which you can use for your games. And so this one is 128 gigs and it'll be preloaded. I always think it's better to use your own games so you can customize your collection, but this will get you off to a good start. Okay, next let's talk about the screen. We'll start with like color balance and saturation. I think it's pretty good in that regard. You can see the colors here really pop, and we can also see a good amount of contrast between the dark and the light points. Now one thing I did notice is that the screen itself is not super bright. This is the brightest it can go. And generally when I do testing like this, I usually will play something at about 50 to 70% brightness. And the fact that I have to crank it all the way up to look good here on camera is not a good sign. Along the same lines, the lowest brightness is not the best either. You can see that here at 0% brightness, we can still see the screen pretty well. And with a lot of other handhelds, when I go down to 0% brightness with the studio lights on like this, you can't see anything. In fact, when turning off the studio lights, you can see that it is still relatively bright. One other thing worth noting is that with the stock firmware, by default, they will have scanline overlays in most of the systems. And so if you do find your games to be too dim, you can disable this overlay, and that's going to make things a little bit brighter. So in general, I would say that the colors here are pretty good, but it doesn't get as bright nor as dim as I would like, especially compared to other devices within this price range. One other unique thing about this device is the bezel. You can see that it has a non-square kind of shape to it. And again, that's very similar to how it was on the original Game Gear, and so I like that they kept that same aesthetic. Now, it does make for larger bezels, but because it's stylized like this, I kind of don't mind it. Although I do think it's going to be a little bit awkward to get some sort of screen protector that's going to work with this shape. You can also see that there's an LED light up here, again very reminiscent of the original styling on the Game Gear. And of note, when you charge it, you will see there are two LEDs. Now all we need is a blue one to complete the package. Now let's do a quick audio test with Streets Rage 2 at 100% volume. So my first impressions here is that the audio quality itself is just fine. Again, what I would expect, it's something costing around $75. However, I will note that the maximum volume here is not super loud compared to other handhelds. Personally, I think it's going to be loud enough for most situations, but in general, this is not as loud as I've seen with others. Of note, I also did test it with headphones and it got quite loud, and the sound was very clear. I also didn't find any sort of crackling that you often find with some of these cheaper handhelds, so I think that if you want a really good audio experience, you're better off just using headphones like this. Okay, let's move on and talk about the software experience, and in full disclosure here, this is an early review unit, and so it's not the full English build of this device. It's still running in Chinese for the most part. So as you can imagine, it's been a bit of a challenge to get this up and running, but I want to at least show you what the experience is going to be like. Now, when you first start up the device, it's going to show you an option to be able to hold the A button, and that's going to launch it directly into Emulation Station. You can see it listed right here. We're not going to do that. Instead, we're going to go to the Lovely Child operating system. That's what you can see right here. So this OS might be familiar if you've ever used one of these handhelds from like 4 or 5 years ago. This is an interface that is often referred to as G-Menu-X. And here we can tab over with the shoulder buttons to find different options. So here is the settings menu. We can tab over. This is all of the arcade systems, at least what it looks like. And then here we've got our handheld systems, then our home consoles. And then we even have things like Java and ports and Easy RPG. Of note, all this stuff is in Chinese, so it's a little bit hard to navigate through. And so if you did want to use this operating system, the idea is that you would go into any of these emulators, and then you would navigate through and choose your game and then launch it from here. And so this is how it was for most handheld systems back in like 2020. And so this is kind of familiar for me. Now, thankfully, you don't have to spend time in this operating system at all. Instead, you can just go into the settings menu, and then right here we have Emulation Station. And like I mentioned before, if you just hold onto the A button when booting up the device, it'll go into it directly. So let's go ahead and press A and then launch Emulation Station so we can get out of Lovely Child and get into something that's a little bit easier to use. Okay, and so this is the Emulation Station user interface that everyone knows and loves. So here we can navigate through, choose our system, and then navigate through the game and then launch it from here instead. And so if you don't want to mess with the Lovely Child or the G-Menu-X setup, you can just go into Emulation Station and kind of avoid all of that. And like I mentioned before, I have a 128GB card, so this is already preloaded with a bunch of games. And if I navigate through, you can see that yes, there are a bunch of games listed here. It won't be a fully comprehensive list, but it will have most of the games for each system. Just bear in mind that much like a lot of the other preloaded cards, there's going to be all sorts of issues. For example, many of these games will be in Chinese instead of English. In addition, many of the ROMs list have a numbering convention, so you can see here that it starts with King of Fighters, then goes into Metal Slug. And so if you're trying to search for a game in alphabetical order, you're not going to be able to find it. It's just kind of in a nonsensical order instead. I think what they try to do is order it by popularity, but that's not going to really mean a lot, especially because what's popular in China may not be popular where you live. Now, there are ways to get around this chaotic numbering scheme. For example, if you take the SD card and put it into your computer, you can use like a batch renaming program to remove all those numbers, and that'll make it a lot easier. In addition, another trick that you can do, for example, when you're in a games list and you want to find a specific game, you can actually search for it. So for example, let's say that we didn't have these Sonic games right here in the front, but you wanted to play Sonic 1. So what you could do is press the select button and then filter games by text. Now just type out the word Sonic and then press this button right here. That's going to filter everything that has the word Sonic in it. And now you can see it has all the Sonic games. So everything that you want to play, including like ROM hacks, they're all going to be here. So that is a quick and easy way to get to the games if you don't want to remove all those numbers first. But as it stands, this is one of the reasons why I recommend using your own ROM library, because then you can just add your own games and you don't have to worry about all this chaotic stuff. Either way, when it comes down to it, every single retro system you can think of is pretty well represented here, everything up through basically Generation 5. It's really going to be up to you whether or not you want to deal with the kind of haphazard organization of these actual games. Of note, a lot of the Nintendo IP has been removed from their system, so things like Mario games you will not find, but it does have Pokemon games. Another thing worth mentioning is that my RetroArch was in Chinese when I first started it up, and I'm not sure how that's going to be for anyone else who's buying one of these devices. But thankfully, it's pretty easy to change out the language. Just go to the settings cog, you'll be able to notice it from the icon, and then go into the user section. Again, you'll see it by that little person. And from there on the bottom, you'll see the language option. You can change it to English or whatever else you would like. Now, when it comes to playing retro-based games, it's all going to be pretty self-explanatory. These games are going to load right up, and you're not going to have any performance issues. But like I mentioned before, the screen is a little bit dim. For example, here we're at 100% brightness, and you can see that it's just barely enough. But at the very least, when it comes to gameplay, yes, I would say these games are playing just fine. Now, one interesting decision right here is you can see that the Game Gear games have their own bezel. So it's a bezel within a bezel. And they've also shrunk down the aspect ratio, so it's not filling up the whole screen. Now, there's a lot of debate about whether or not it should be 8:7 or 4:3. But personally, when it comes to Game Gear, I'm team 4:3. After all, the original screen was a 4:3 image. Either way, it is pretty easy to change this out. We're going to press the menu button to get into RetroArch Quick Menu. And then here under On-Screen Overlay, we're just going to turn that off. Now we're going to go into Settings, then Video, and then under Scaling, we're going to change the aspect ratio to Core Provided. Now when we resume the game, you can see that it's going to fill up the whole screen, and I think that looks a lot better. And once you've done that, and you want to save it for future Game Gear games, just go back into the quick menu, go into Overrides, and then select Save Content Directory Override. From now on, any Game Gear game is going to play at full screen. And you'll find it's a similar setup with the Game Boy and Game Boy Color games. It'll be up to you whether or not you want to make it full screen or remove the bezels. This one right here is actually integer scaled, so it actually looks pretty good. It is a little bit weird to have two different logos like this in the on-screen overlay, but it's all going to be up to you. Same thing with Game Boy Advance. I think it actually looks pretty good on this screen, but you can see that yes, it's blown up all the way across the left and right, but we do have black bars at the top and bottom, and they've added the Game Boy Advance here in the overlay. And so if you'd like, you can turn off the overlay and then make an override. Now when it comes to the higher end systems, things like Nintendo 64 and Dreamcast and so on, things do get a little bit trickier just because this chipset cannot handle all of these games. When it comes to Nintendo 64, they are using the parallel core within RetroArch, and this does a pretty good job. I would say maybe 3/4 of games are going to play pretty well with maybe some minimal slowdown. So in other words, I wouldn't expect to be able to play 007 or Conker's Bad Fur Day, but you know, lighter weight titles like Turok like this will play just fine. By the way, this game is almost impossible to play by modern standards. You actually have to move with the right analog stick and then aim with the left one. So this kind of breaks my 2024 brain right here. Now when it comes to Sega Dreamcast, the performance will be a little bit better, and that's because the Flycast core within RetroArch does use frame skip. That means that even though we're not going to get a full 60 frames per second all the time, the gameplay itself will be relatively smooth. So as long as you're not picky about making sure you get every single frame, I think this is a mostly playable experience when it comes to Dreamcast. Of note, this device has rumble. It's not super good, like it just kind of rattles everything, but when you're playing something like Sonic Adventure 2, you will feel it. Now in terms of Sega Saturn, this is running the Yabasan Shiro standalone emulator, and that actually works pretty well on this chipset. It is going to utilize a frame skip, but I think that most games will be playable. The really high tier games like Sega Rally Championship, those have a bit of slowdown, but you can see here, even with Die Hard Arcade, it's actually playing really well. So I would not go as far as saying this is a Sega Saturn capable handheld, but thanks to that standalone emulator, most games will play pretty well. Now when it comes to PSP, it's actually surprisingly good in terms of performance. The screen is going to be a little bit small, after all it's only 3.5 inches and 4:3, but I think for many games it'll be at least playable enough, and the performance here is not half bad. For example, here with Tekken 6, not an easy game to run, it's running at basically full speed. There are a couple stutters here and there which are pretty typical with this game in particular right in the beginning of a scene, but I personally would consider this to be playable even though it is only at a 1x or native resolution. So chances are if there are specific PSP games that you want to play, they might be able to play here as long as performance is not a huge issue. Now my device was also set to Chinese with PSP. This is also a pretty easy fix. Go into the settings and go into this bottom section, and then this right here is actually the language. So we can go into here and then find English or whatever other language you want. But I think when it comes down to it, the best fit for this device happens to be retro games. And I'm not sure if it's because of this overall aesthetic, you know, the fact that it looks like a Game Gear, but I found that playing things like Game Gear games, but then even like retro systems like NES have been really great. And so it'll really come down to what you're actually looking to play, and so I wouldn't buy this specifically for like Nintendo 64, Dreamcast, PSP, or Saturn, but for all the retro systems below that, all the way up through PS1, those will play just fine. Okay, at this point, I think it's time to start wrapping up and talk about what I like and what I don't like about the GKD Bubble. As always, we'll start with the good stuff, and number one for me is the aesthetics and design. And like I mentioned in the intro, I've always wanted a Game Gear, and so I'm a little bit biased in that regard, but I love the fact that this is just a tiny version of the original Game Gear that I can actually fit in a shorts pocket. In addition, it's got a better and bigger screen than the original product, and so it's kind of neat that you can play just thousands of games on something that reminds me of another device from 1990. And so I will say that right off the bat, having a cool design like this gets a lot of brownie points in my book. Now there are other things I like about it as well. I actually like the texture of the plastic. It feels a bit like a cheap toy, but I kind of like that. I'd much rather have a device that knows what it is than something that tries to be premium and then fails at it. And in that regard, I think this is a really fun device and I like that overall feel. I also think that the controls are pretty good, all things considered. There are a couple things that leave me scratching my head, like the fact that the D-pad is a little bit too sensitive, and I also don't like the placement of the menu button, but for everything else, it's actually pretty easy to control. And so I think just from an overall hardware perspective, we have some pretty good bones to work with. And then finally, kind of going together with the whole design thing is the fact that I find this to be so nostalgic. Obviously, I know this is not a Game Gear, but the fact that it kind of looks and feels like one really does elevate that experience for me. And to be honest, playing on a Game Gear in 2024 is not a great experience if you ask me. The screen is super hard to see and it eats through batteries so quick. So it is nice that we're kind of cheating here with the GKD Bubble and having a 2024 experience. Now, of course, this is not a perfect device, and so there are a couple things worth mentioning. The number one thing that concerns me is the dim screen. Among all the things that have to do with the hardware, that's the one where I'm a little bit worried. I think it'll be fine when playing it indoors, but I don't think this is a device that I would like to take with me out and about. I just don't think it's going to be able to hold up to daylight levels of brightness, so this is something that I would rather keep at home than take with me. Now, another thing that is kind of lacking has to do with just the overall rollout of this OS. Obviously, for me, it's a little bit harder of an experience because it's all in Chinese, but I was able to at least get my way around it. And to be honest, the ability to be able to launch into Emulation Station and also get into RetroArch really kind of solves most of my issues anyway. And so I'm not really sure what it's going to look like when it ships out to other audiences, but I do hope the language issues do get fixed. Thankfully, we've already got a custom operating system available for us. Now, this is made by a Japanese developer, but they do have an English language component, and so you'll be able to flash this on your device, and this will basically be an improved version of the stock operating system, and so I'll leave a link to this in the video description below. In addition, I have seen that a developer named Gamma Squeeze is working on an Android port, and so we might be able to see that in the future as well. And then finally, if you look on the MooOS website, down below under their planned projects, they have the GKD Bubble listed. And so it might turn out to be that MooOS will be available for this device, and I think that would be pretty awesome. So in general, even though I think the current OS experience is not great, we're already seeing signs that this will be improved in the future as long as the community also likes this device. And then finally, at a $75 price point, I think that's a pretty good deal for what we're getting, but you also have to remember the market that this handheld is launching in. And there are plenty of other devices available between $60 and $75 that will give you very similar performance. And so in that regard, I would say unless you really like this form factor and the overall look of it, then you may want to shop around elsewhere. And when it comes down to it, one of the best things about having so many handhelds out there right now is that there might be one that's a better fit for you than this one. And obviously I've reviewed just about every single one that's launched, and so I would just recommend checking out one of those other reviews if you like the shape and look of that one better. But I will say that for my part, I am actually a fan of the overall look and feel of the GKD Bubble. I think if we get some better custom OS options, and if it maybe drops down to price closer to something like $65, it's going to be a steal. When it comes down to it, I think that the overall hardware of this device is good, and if the software catches up, this might be a really fantastic handheld down the line. And so if you're wondering whether or not I recommend the GKD Bubble, I think it's going to come down to you. If you're the type of person who kind of collects these as a hobby, like for example, you don't mind messing around with the settings and going into Discord and checking up on the latest and greatest, then I think there's a lot of fun to be had with the GKD Bubble because it does seem like this is going to be a good device going forward. However, if you're just looking for an out-of-box experience, at least right now, I think that it's probably going to be a little bit more hassle than you want. And so in that regard, I would recommend getting something that's going to be a little bit more mature than this one. At the end of the day, I do like the GKD Bubble. It's a lot of fun to hold, and I honestly think that the controls are pretty great too. And so I am going to keep my eye on this one in the future because I do think it has a lot of potential. So I think if I had to put it all together, I would say that yes, this is a handheld that is pretty great, but there are so many others out there like it. And so unless there's something really special about this device for you like it is for me, then you might be able to skip this one. Anyway, let me know what you think in the comments down below. Are you a big fan of the Game Gear? Do you think this one really scratches that itch for you? Or do you think there's an element missing to it? For example, does it need a 6-button layout? For my part, I'm pretty happy as it is, but I'm excited to see what it's going to look like in a few months. As always, thank you for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful, and we will see you next time. Happy gaming.